All right, we'll get started here in a minute. Thank you everyone for joining. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We are very excited for this 5-part series coming your way. My name is Rob Zanino, and I've got my partner in crime, Justin Marcellus, on. We are going to be your MCs for this 5-part series. We've got a lot of great stuff coming your way. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolving threat landscape, and later sessions, we'll be diving into new innovations that Google's releasing on the security side, all sorts of great stuff. I want to start today by giving a special shout out to our sponsor of the week, Dido. Dido is this Google Security Partner of the Year. They've done some amazing stuff, and we're fortunate enough today to have their very own Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer, Rich Foltak. Rich, thanks for joining. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for joining. I also wanted to give a shout out and welcome to Google's very own Head of Security and Compliance Solutions and Go-to-Market Strategies, Javier Dominguez. Javi, how you doing?
Oh, good. Thank you for having me.
Great. Before we get started, just want to give a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We might not be able to cover them on the call today, but we should have some specialists on that should be there to answer. We're also planning on sending out a form following this conversation. In that form, you can, number one, provide feedback that's super valuable to us. You can input areas where your business might be struggling or questions that you have, as well as request time to speak with a Google or Dido specialist regarding some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Also want to make a note, if you feel like you should have received an Uber Eats gift card, but it didn't come your way, feel free to add that to the form and we'll make sure that we have you covered for next week. We're super appreciative that you're joining us today, and we have got some amazing content that we'll be presenting. So with that, I'll kick it off. Rich, I'm going to direct this question to you. Rich, you've been in this space, and let me actually just quickly stop presenting here so you can see our great speakers' faces. Rich, you've been in this space for a long time. You've spent time at Verizon, Cisco, and now you're the CISO and Senior Vice President at Dido. Tell me about some of the biggest changes you've seen over the last few years in this security implications to some of those changes.
I take the analogy of a frog in boiling water, where you put them into lukewarm water and you start heating it up. They don't recognize the fact that their environment has changed. And I keep running into this these days because I was one of those frogs myself that is now going around to all the frogs saying, we're in boiling water, we need to respond to this environment. And it kind of it all translates back to this concept of this, what a lot of people think of is a marketing term, which we refer to as digital transformation. But the reality is there is a lot of depth to that statement. What does digital transformation really mean? And it really means it's changing the business focus, whereby IT is no longer this idea that supports the business. It is the business. It's integral into its DNA, right? We're changing this entire model from saying that in the past, we got to stand up these, we got an application, we got to stand up the hardware, we got to get this all deployed. Timelines are 18 months, a lot of planning involved, and it was very structured in the way everything was done. Well, today the cycle times are tremendously different. They've evolved aggressively. And let me give you an example of this, okay, and why this is very radical, and why the boardrooms are changing in all the Fortune 1000 companies today. Many years ago, probably around 2016. I was at Verizon. I was on a conference call where a chief technology officer, and he was furious. He was furious because one of our competitors came out with a solution to the marketplace that was viewed as being radical and transformational. And to him, not having an ability to respond was a major issue, right? His job was on the line for all intents and purposes. And he was yelling, what do we need to do? How can we get this resolved? And so there was a follow-up call from that Thursday to Tuesday, where during that interim period of time, a team of developers using a PaaS solution, in this case, it was Pivotal Cloud Foundry, they were able to take that PaaS solution and build that exact replica model of that competitor solution for Verizon and demo it and say, we're ready to go live. Not necessarily true, but 6 days later, they had a working application that they wanted to go to market as a response to our competitive pressure. Now, here's the problem. We weren't on the cloud. We had our own data centers. We operated a very lean operating team as it was, but it still took us 9 months to take that application and deploy it into the field because of the time it takes to figure out what is the right hardware to put into place, order it, stitch it, configure it, get it going. We lost that 9 months in time. And the consequence of that decision, that ability for the infrastructure team not to be able to respond to the fact that the software world has radically changed. I mean, we're dealing with an entire pipeline of technologies around software that have changed the game on the way companies can move. Yet the infrastructure team was still slow and methodical. I mean, look, they were doing everything right, but it still took 9 months, which meant that the executive team can't respond to market pressures in the same way. After that, Verizon decided that they're going to have a cloud strategy where a significant amount of their workloads, all their new workloads, were going to go to the public cloud. And so that was sort of like a wake-up call that the world has changed, but what does that really mean? And to reinforce it, because I keep running into people saying, well, that was Verizon, we're the government, we're slow. Well, when the COVID-19 scheduler came in, New York State is a Google customer, and they were deploying an application, and they had put something together, but they had 2 weeks before going live, they engaged Dido with Google to help secure their solution. So now, any security team, if you ask them, you got 2 weeks to harden this architecture and get it going, most of them will freak out because they're like, well, you can't authenticate because we want everyone to log in. I mean, we came in, completely revamped the front end, protected it against bots. We embedded reCAPTCHA Enterprise from Google. Again, not trying to focus on Teams, but we completely protected their API and their backend application from hackers. And we did this all within a very, very short cycle time. And that's the key that I'm trying to address, is that the demands of the business and the business objectives are growing into hyperdrive. We're still having to deal with cybersecurity requirements that are in place. And then we have technical environment requirements in place. So if you look at it from a cybersecurity framework perspective, building those operating methodologies and everything else, they're radically changing. And most security teams are just not aware of the fact that they're in boiling water, back to the frog analogy, and they have to adapt to this new reality. And it's not a tool question. Okay, so let's be focused on this. This is a people process aspect where people haven't realized that this is happening. And I'm calling this out as a environmental landscape threat because as a cybersecurity risk management individual, you should be able to understand that what used to work is not acceptable today. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Rich. And I think we see a lot of what you're talking about here, especially at Google. And to that point, I think we have a great person to be able to speak to that. So Javier, based on what Rich is saying here, can you comment on some of those trends that you're seeing as far as, we're talking about faster development cycles, kind of like hybrid work, and how all this has changed with COVID-19 and how we do business together in this new digital world?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yes, as Rich mentioned, right, so organizations now are pressured to work on short time to market cycles. And that is increasing in the case of software, it's increasing the use of microservices architectures because they are more dynamic and agile in terms of how you can develop apps. In general, this increases the ability or the agility of the teams because you can do changes into individual components and do that quickly. So you can actually make apps easier, you can develop at scale. Containers in particular are streamlined or have been designed to allow organizations to build, test, deploy, and applications on multiple environments very quickly from a developer's laptop or repo into an on-premise data center or the cloud. And by decoupling the binaries needed by the applications from the underlying host, that makes applications very portable. Now, what happens is that most of the software that is being deployed on these containers and microservice architectures is actually written from scratch. It is typically a combination of code with artifacts, container, open source software. And when you use open source libraries and packages to build applications, you're subject to a lot of security risks. Actually, on average, 210 dependencies on open source are found per repo, and that is code that you didn't entirely write. Other industry data suggests that, for example, 99% of code bases contain open source code, and anywhere between 85 and 97% of enterprise code comes from open source. Really, it's not just open source components, but all software artifacts are subject to vulnerabilities. And developers teams who self-manage their microservices typically show less control over code from third parties or really actually any changes made to a software over time. Because of this reality, and also because software is essential to executing daily business operations, software supply chain security needs to become a critical priority for every security team. Securing the software supply chain not just requires organizations to secure the code they write, but everything that goes into it. For example, third-party dependencies or binaries. As the code goes from development to production, each step of the supply chain needs to be secure because every step is vulnerable to attacks. Developers need to play a much active role in terms of security by embedding security policies into their practices. In fact, the shift-left approach to cybersecurity, which we see in this new discipline that is called DevSecOps, where automation and security reviews and code scanning and vulnerability management are implemented early in the development lifecycle, is absolutely important. Attacks can happen along the software lifecycle. There are several ways to do it. You can insert malicious code as a new committer. You can take over an account of someone else in order to do that without others noticing, or you can compromise a signing key in order to distribute software that isn't officially part of a component. So if you ask me about trends, what I see in terms of software supply, I say that there are three of them. The first one is hijacking updates. Those are basically attacks where basically an extremely capable actor is able to sign a software by using a stolen or forged certificate, and then use that software update in order to carry malware and to target networks. Then the malware will spread, and then it will exploit known vulnerabilities or will look for elevations of privilege or just basically trigger ransomware attack. Other one is open source compromise, which is on the rise, where attackers modify open source by compromising a user account, or they pose their own packages using names that are similar or commonly used. Then the malicious code is spread, and is usually used to steal data or launch other types of attacks. And lastly, also very important, it seems like we have been talking about this for a long time, is unpatched software, especially in open source. But given that organizations are not going to stop using open source, and 85% of vulnerabilities in open source are disclosed with a patch already available, teams need to make sure that they continuously monitor what dependencies they have. They track vulnerabilities in those dependencies and make sure that they are patched. So in conclusion, if you ask me, security and developer teams need to place and automate controls at every step of the development process in order to protect against bad code, look for vulnerable dependencies, and monitor if there is any compromised build system. Traditional security models focused on perimeter controls don't help. At very high level, organizations that really want to reduce the risk associated to software supply chain need to do a few things. First, enforce the concept of less privilege to access resource across the supply chain. That means how to access developer tools, how the source code repositories are accessed, enable MFA for the developers. Assess the security of the code that is being consumed. Make sure that developers are trained to ensure that they're writing secure code. Implement processes and tools to securely build and deploy the code. Harden data transfer methods and secure keys used by applications, and continuously test and monitor the applications to look for vulnerabilities and threats. And that's why I like the idea of introducing zero trust through the process of releasing software. Not just trusting any step of the CI/CD process just because you own it, because it's inside of your network. And that basically means applying zero trust to the way that we're developing applications and deploying applications.
And Javier, I do want to, you brought up a great point at the end around trust. And, Rich, I just wanted to get a sense from you. You work with so many different clients, both Google and, other cloud providers. What are some of your recommendations around setting up a trust strategy?
Well, again, I have a don't trust anyone, including yourself strategy as a model, because if I know how to get in and through a back door into my environment, so can potentially a very dedicated hacker in the ecosystem. And so, Javier mentioned a lot about open source, and I'm going to say that open source and commercial is not much different in terms of vulnerabilities between the two. SolarWinds is a good example of this, right? It's a trusted, reputable third-party vendor that it got compromised, and then in the end compromised their entire network of practitioners or users in their community. And that can happen to anyone. So I don't want to throw SolarWinds under the bus here, because that can literally happen to just about any business. And when I worked at Cisco, right, they were P-certs. There were, you found findings, you fixed it, you patched it, you went in, and then you made an announcement. And there's zero-day vulnerabilities in almost every software that's out there. But when I go in and I scan, I ask customers, and it's like, when was the last time you scanned your software? Just because a vulnerability wasn't there 6 months ago doesn't mean it wasn't there, it just wasn't known. And so the idea of a lot of these scanning tools that are out there from third parties or Google or others, when they scan the code, they look for the current list of vulnerabilities that are known. And those may change. Just because you scanned it 6 months ago and you didn't change anything in your software doesn't mean that a vulnerability does not exist in that particular software. So this idea of CI/CD still has to be driven from the perspective of compliance and making sure that I'm aware of any library vulnerability that I may be using in my packaging, because times change, new information comes out. Day zero vulnerabilities are still found, about once a year. Some major day zero comes out across the operating system. And it really kind of goes to this approach that you can't really trust anything. But what does that mean? Like, let's take it back to a practical perspective, right? It just means that you need to have controls or mitigations against what if something's wrong with this control. Do I have a secondary control that will limit the blast radius of this going haywire for me, right? Because just to give you an example, say you did have your network compromised with a Trojan from third-party software. If you make the ability of that packet to get back onto the internet very difficult, right? And you basically deny all flows that are not permitted flows into your network. And then you have alarm bells with logs coming out and saying, hey, someone is trying to talk through this port to this thing to come out to the internet. You could identify these particular Trojans that have gotten into your network. But most people don't. I mean, I'm just going to be totally honest. It's like, they're like, oh yeah, just, put up some cloud NAT, get it out. I need to get to the internet. And those same avenues are being used to engage, people trying to exfiltrate out into the internet and then get new commands for themselves. And, back to this whole zero trust. Don't trust anyone coming out of your network, one option, but also how you gain access into your network is really a big push. This is one of the areas that we really work hard with Google with their Beyond Corp and that zero trust model in terms of gaining access into your network. You see, because it's our view, it's my view that your laptop, your BYOD device is already compromised. And we can go into a long debate of, if I run this software, this, that. My view is, I'm sorry, if you're surfing the net, you've been compromised, you just don't know it. But that being said, how do I then mitigate that risk of you accessing into my environment? I don't believe client VPNs work. mean, they work, but they're not secure from a solution perspective. And so when you have one foot in a very unsecure environment and you have another foot into what you believe is a secure environment, and then you have all access to your entire network, that is not a secure model. So this idea of being able to say that you, from your identity, from your device, from your location, from a context access perspective, are only granted to access or network connectivity to only the resources you need to perform in your job, that reduces the blast radius tremendously, because it means your insiders, even if they're either well-intentioned or malintended, in capability, would not be able to do harm onto your system. And so this is a big mindset shift that it's like your people are asking, well, okay, so Rich, the world's changing really fast. What do I do? Well, automate everything, right? Become part of DevSecOps. Don't ignore it. Don't stitch on security. Don't be DevOps plus security, because I see that a lot. I strongly discourage that practice. Get yourself into the agile teams, embed yourself into the pipeline, really important. But then the other aspect too is don't trust the perimeter doesn't work, right? Everything should be micro perimeters and everything should be isolated based on your need, your identity, and your need to perform or use certain capabilities. And all of these changes are small. They're not hard, but it requires a change in mindset. And this is why we're not talking about any specific technology today. We're focusing on sort of shifting the brain to start thinking back to the first principles of security and start thinking in that way that, hey, I got to move faster. I got to move. Everything now is a threat. How do I respond in this world? And companies are being very successful at responding to this. It's not like you can't do this, but it does mean there is a paradigm shift in thinking. And that's the message that I would like to relay to the audience out there. This digital transformation journey companies are taking is real. Companies are tremendously benefiting from this and their ability to move fast, respond, get market share, build businesses. But security on that is, in my opinion, somewhat lapse. It can be improved. Some companies are doing a great job, others are not. And so this is where we're kind of going in. Is like, look, you could lead, you could follow, or you can get out of the way, because that's eventually what's going to happen. There are leaders out there that are making new paths for everyone else. But the crazy part is if you look in the industry, they're all putting the recipes out for everyone else to see. It isn't hard to replicate their implementation and go to GitHub and open source, right? But follow their Terraform plans and their landing zone, their secure blueprints, what Google kind of recommends. This is not hard to replicate best practice and then follow that. You can quickly adapt to your competitors' positioning. Because if you don't, then the get out of the way comes into play where teams are being replaced. And that's what I see within the industry, that IT organizations are just being outsourced to organizations that are able to deal with that. And I'm not in favor of that, but it's not something within my control to deal with. But hopefully that gives us sort of a big picture as to where we're at.
Yeah, Rich, there's a lot to unpack with what you just said. There's a lot behind that. But like some of the common themes that I'm hearing from you is zero trust. We talked a little bit about Beyond Corp. One thing that I really loved was you talked about blast radius. And I think you also kind of like straddled the line between the two areas that we have here when it comes to a zero trust model, which is we have this network perimeter and security in the network and kind of like on the perimeter of the network. And then we also have identity and access management. And these two things together like really make this zero trust environment work well. And so Javier, my question to you is like, can we dive a little further into identity and access management, some of the best practices we see around that? How do we do it at Google and at scale?
Sure. This is an area that I'm very actually passionate about. Multiple vendors and the industry have expressed the urgency of actually starting to treat identity as a new perimeter, right? So instead of the network. And to be honest, a lot of progress has been made with the wide adoption of MFA, for example. And also organizations have spent a lot of effort improving IAM capabilities with the adoption of, for example, Okta, Ping, Google Cloud Identity. Much of the focus has been on user authentication. Now, it is true that this represents an important security advance because now you can do context-aware policies, but ironically, it's also increasing the attack surface. So now it's actually more important to make sure that you can protect all identity systems and detect when they are compromised, and so you can enable rapid investigations and efficient remediation, right? So you can be fast. Keep in mind that stolen credentials still account for 61% of data breaches. It's actually growing because cyber attackers and more sophisticated advanced persistent threats are finding new ways to compromise IAM platforms. So there is actually something that I will encourage people to look at. There's a new security category defined by Gartner very recently, which actually could be very helpful. It's called ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response, which goal is to provide the ability to organizations to detect credential theft, privilege misuse, and attacks to Active Directory, or actually basically any user directory, as well as identify, for example, risk entitlements that can create an attack path. ITDR solutions are about protecting identities, as I mentioned, entitlements, and I think that organizations should look at them as a way to complement their current investments, for example, in EDR or XDR platforms. So let me spend some time to explain some of the ITDR capabilities that I think that are important and how they will benefit a typical organization. ITDR should offer insights to proactively shoot down paths to critical assets. This means basically maps, right? So maps that show you how adversaries might move on the network and advance their attacks from one system to another one. So that way you can discover elements through the network that could be at risk, that could be exposed to lateral movement, orphan credentials, or, for example, policy violations. Deception features are also very important and good to use because it's a way to confuse and expose attackers. You can steer the attackers away from your crown jewels and instead direct them into dead-end alleys with fake information. Another great example of using deception features is redirecting an attacker lateral movement traffic to network decoys where they cannot get anything, or feed false credentials to the attackers so you can engage them and actually force them to reveal themselves. Another one that is important is the possibility of actually enable this concept of user and entity behaviors analytics that is supported by machine learning. So you can detect abnormal behaviors or events. For example, being able to see when a user is downloading more data that usually is downloading. So organizations can actually benefit from analyzing user activities. So you can track what resources typically a user access, from what type of devices, at what times of the day, from what locations. And with that information, you can create a baseline that then you can use to build models. So then you can point to anomalies when those happens. So then this leads to another great feature, which is going to be how these solutions can integrate with your MFA platform to enforce the use of additional authentication factors in response to some of these risk events. So for example, if I'm seeing a user that is coming from an abnormal location, or that is downloading a typical amount of data, for example, or is accessing resources that typically is not accessing, how you can trigger MFA to confirm that that account hasn't been compromised. It's also important to leverage account takeover detection techniques that are super helpful, for example, to spot Kerberos golden ticket attacks or passive ticket attacks. And as we all know, errors or misconfigurations continue to be a dominant trend. And actually still, they're responsible for 13% of breaches. And that's why ITDR tools, I think, that can provide a lot of valuable guidance because they can help to assess the security posture of any organization's directory, for example, AD. And for example, identify access control lists and delegation misconfigurations that are giving accounts elevated rights without proper group membership. So someone was assigned a right without actually making that user be part of a security group. And this continuous assessment can also help to get visibility into other common issues like service accounts and accounts that are being reused that could allow an attacker to elevate privilege on a specific endpoints. I do believe that in the case of identity, there is another big challenge that organizations are facing, which is that data needs to be accessible, right, in order to drive business outcomes. So organizations need to remove barriers to data in order to make teams actually be able to realize the value out of it. And this very same statement actually conflicts with some security principles, which is leading to over-permission users. Some of the recent numbers actually indicate that 90% of cloud identities are too permissive. And at least 25% of data breaches are currently a consequence of insiders. There's another proof that comes in the Verizon data breach investigation report, which says that privilege abuse remains one of the top 10 reasons of successful breaches. But yet, digital transformation is fueling an exponential growth of privileged users, not just because of IT users, business partners, but especially non-human identities. So the scale and impact of this type of abuse is just increasing. The consequences, accumulation of permissions are just increasing, never decreasing, and the corresponding unauthorized access or data leaks that happen because of this. And why? Because teams basically lack unreliable, repeatable processes to approve, deny access to permissions, But I think that more importantly, how to maintain them, right? So how to make sure that you can update as part of your joiner, mover, lever process. So as apps and infra move to the cloud, critical data is going to spread, and it's going to spread across an increasing number of systems. And the issue is that these systems, or actually specific components of these systems, lack in terms of standardization of permission models, which makes very difficult for teams to manage data entitlements. But at the same time, also organizations are struggling because their current solutions, the things that are currently implemented, don't fully help to manage privileged access, and to be honest, haven't been adapted to modern cloud data ecosystems. So in my opinion, what security teams need to do is make sure that they evaluate tools that can adapt to their current challenges, especially because of the cloud adoption and the spread of data in new architectures, but also make sure that they have the right processes and the automation to enforce less privileged access, to ensure that they can right-size permissions based on how the permissions are being used, how the users are actually using permissions, and make sure that there is no standing permission ever given. That is always people or users or accounts are made eligible to request a permission, and that happens on demand after it goes through an approval process.
Awesome. Javier, that was great. Both of you, this has been amazing. We are running close to time. I do want to give each of you a few minutes just to give some closing remarks. Rich, I also hate to put you on the spot here, but wanted to ask you, if one of our listeners on, how can they get involved with DITA, or how can they get in touch with you?
They can reach out on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active in the LinkedIn community. I'm actually encouraging people to continue their educational journey in cloud, particularly in cybersecurity. One of my big sort of like pet projects on the side is to really encourage people from around the world to really look at IT as an enabler, a career sort of like get out of Dodge sort of approach to it. Because look, you have people going through transitions in their lives, midlife crises, family changes in their situation. And when you realize that the barriers to entry are actually very low in the IT space, it doesn't take much, just to give you an example, to pay $15 to go to Udemy, get a course on Kubernetes, to get your CKA or CKAD certification in Kubernetes, and you will land a job reasonably quickly because there's such a shortage of talent around these new PaaS platforms that are out there. Or someone in cybersecurity, this recently happened, just FYI, I had a colleague in the UK, and he had a CISSP, he was a security guy, and he felt he was in a rut in his job. And he says, what do I do? And I gave him the same advice. Take something you're passionate about, machine learning or Kubernetes, and go in, educate yourself on that. The moment he got his CKA and CKAD, he had a bidding war for him, doubled his salary, and is now working in a different job. I'm very happy with the fact that he did that. Why? Because there are a lot of people who have a security mindset, and there may be a lot of people who have, say, specific skills that are needed today in the cloud. But in the development community, there's a huge skill shortage of people who understand security in that pipeline process. So, we talk DevSecOps, but the folks who have the right mindset in security to be in that sec part of that DevSecOps is a very small group of people. There's a huge demand in the industry for it. And so I'm encouraging people to really adapt their skill sets and move forward across the board. Keep your skills moving, not just with Google, but also just across the board with the tools that are hot in demand these days, because there's a shortage of them.
and keep showing up to lunch and learns like these, right?
Absolutely.
Javier, how about you? Any closing remarks on your end before we close out?
Sure. No, thank you for the opportunity, and a great comment by Rachel. I think that's absolutely important. What I will mention is kind of related to some of my previous comments is that, attackers don't think in silos. So, security teams and developers need to start also, following that practice. I mean, we need to make sure that whatever process we deploy, whatever tools we choose, actually are part of a bigger scheme, right? So are part of a bigger process that allow the proper security controls to be deployed, but more importantly, in my opinion, the proper responses to be taken, right? Because when you have silos, when you have disconnected tools or disconnected process, what will happen is that typically you will miss important things. So you cannot respond and react at the speed that you should be doing it, considering what is happening on cybersecurity, right? So I think that looking at the process and the tool selection instead of silos and more in an end-to-end process, and how you can bring that as early as possible into your development and basically any practice is going to be my final recommendation.
I love that. I love that. Well, appreciate you both for taking the time to come on today. I thought the conversation was great. I certainly learned a lot. And so next Thursday, we've got Unpacking Google Security Portfolio. We have another great set of speakers that will be joining us. But that's all we've got for today. So thank you both. Thank you, Justin. And we'll see you next Thursday.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you.